Welcome to Season 9 of the Life Giver Podcast, a place for honest conversation about you, your relationships, and the leader you're meant to be to those around you. I'm your host, Corey Weathers. I'm a wife, mom, licensed professional counselor, and many other things. But today, I'm here to breathe life back into you. Welcome to another episode of the Life Giver Podcast. This is your host, Corey. I don't know why I start off like that every single time. Like, I think everybody knows that. Knows that it's the Life Giver Podcast because you chose it, and knows my voice probably by now too. If you are listening for the very first time, thank you for joining. This season is all about a lot of things. If you are just catching up, I started the season with a few episodes on the hero's journey, which I covered in the last episode. Was a really neat idea, something I am passionate about, but something I just couldn't quite wrap my mind around and get my motivation around. So I adjusted, I pivoted, and took a different direction for this season and really wanted to get back to relationships, getting back to the core of what really matters the most. And yes, motivating yourself, trying new things, taking risks, your own personal hero's journey is critical. It is so important. But you know what can hijack any superhero journey? I mean, read any comic book, watch any movie with your typical story arc with a hero, and relationships. If not the internal battle within, it is the relationships on the outside that can sabotage your hero's journey. It can tempt your hero's journey to go off track. It can make your hero's journey more fulfilling. It plays such an important role in your happiness, your joy. And that's why every superhero does not do well alone. I mean, any comic book, there is either a love interest or some kind of battle for something outside of what it is that they do every single day. And so that was part of what was really resonating in me, is that I could cover how do you become the best version of yourself? And that is important. Some of you out there really, really need that. You have been giving everything to people around you for a very long time, and it's time for you to take a turn. And that is still important. Please do that in a healthy way. But if you are doing those things in a way that causes destruction in your family and in your home and in your marriage, then it doesn't matter, right? So there has to be a way for you to evolve as a healthy person, and also for you to invest in your relationships in a meaningful way so that everybody gets across the finish line, that all of these relationships get across the finish line. When we talk about retiring from a career of service, whether it's military, first responder, whatever it is that you do, that career will eventually end. Any role really that we take on other than marriage, maybe, will change at some point. You will have your kids grow up and they will launch. In fact, Matt and I are about to be empty nesters. We're about to launch our second son to college, and we're about to PCS also this summer, and then launch him to college. And we will be empty nesters. And we have already had the taste of that with a few days of just several days in a row of nothing to do, and it just being the two of us, and realizing, oh my goodness, we're really excited about cooking for ourselves, but after about 3 days, it was like, we're already tired of cooking for ourselves, and we've got to be careful or we're going to be going out to eat all the time. So even parenting, when you put all of your energy and all of your thinking and all of your talents towards raising these people, which is a worthy investment, eventually your children will launch and it will be just you. It'll be just your marriage. And yes, we could talk about death. We could talk about marriages ending. And yes, that's why the hero's journey matters as well. But I hope that you hear what I'm trying to say here is that if you're in relationship, then you want those relationships to succeed. And when they are not succeeding, it becomes the hardest season of your life. It is hard to succeed at work when your marriage isn't going well. It is hard to succeed at parenting when your marriage is going through a rough season. It is hard for you to work on yourself when your marriage is going through a rough season. So that's why I wanted to come back to this. I wanted to come back to the relationships that really matter, the relationships that are the hardest to figure out, to figure out how to help them succeed. And I wanted to come back to encouraging more of that in your life. So in the last episode, we talked about introducing the messy middle. And we are going to be pulling from that messy middle throughout the rest of this season. There's lots of things that we could cover in my Substack that I put out recently that went with the last episode. I kind of gave you a glimpse of some phrases that came to mind when I was thinking about the messy middle. Last episode, we talked about boundaries versus grace. That is one of the biggest ones that come up in sessions with couples is how do you know when to set boundaries versus when do you need to give grace? And my frequent answer, which is it's always changing, and that's why it's messy in the middle. And I talked about in the last episode these extremes, these finding these opposite extremes and really thinking through when you're making a decision, when you're trying to figure out what's the right thing to do, to really use that spectrum of extremes to help you find what is really destructive, going really far one way versus really far another way. And if you can find those extremes, then you can do a pretty good guess of what's in the middle is probably healthy. And so we talked about that and talked about guardrails and knowing what your guardrails, knowing what your deal breakers are in a relationship are really important. I would say when I'm working with couples that are in conflict, it almost always, if not 100% of the time, comes down to a difference in values. And most people get married thinking that they have the same values or they wouldn't have married that person. But I think often when we are young and we get married, we don't realize that values can be broken down into like sub values, right? So we can agree that loyalty is important. We can agree that family is important and that marriage is important. And then husband and wife roles are important. And you could even get married and say, you know what, as a wife, I want to choose to stay home with my kids as long as possible. And the husband might take on that traditional expectation and role that they're going to provide for the family. But rarely do we talk about, even in premarital counseling, do we talk about what is the role of the woman or the man, or what is the role of what does it mean and what does it look like daily to be a wife? What are the expectations that we have for each other? And so then we get married and everybody brings in these big expectations. And then what happens? Everything starts to fall apart because we all know that expectations are brought in accidentally. We don't realize that we have them until we realize we're expecting something that our spouse may not be able to or be capable of doing well. Or they didn't grow up that way and they didn't even know that was on your radar. And so expectations really play a huge part in bringing in a lot of conflict, especially in the early days, but also in our every single day as we stay married over the years and over the decades. So today, we are going to talk about the dichotomy, the difficulty in trying to juggle your own individual wellness versus your expectations as a couple. And I'm going to lay this out for you by sharing with you one of my favorite metaphors that I've used for a long time. I referenced it in the last episode. I don't think I've ever shared with it. I've never shared it publicly where it's recorded. And so I'm really excited to share it with you. And it is called the duplex. And I've been using this metaphor for years. And a lot of people have really enjoyed it. And so I don't remember where this started. I do remember when I was in Augusta, Georgia, working with an adolescent girls group at the time. I had developed a program for adolescent girls. And I remember helping some of the girls figure out what their rules were going to be. And I think that's how the duplex actually started. It actually didn't start with marriage. It actually started with understanding your own personal boundaries as an individual and deciding what your rules are, and then deciding how you're going to be assertive and kind and communicate what your rules are for yourself. And so I remember working with some of the girls on them trying to figure that out. And that makes sense, right? Because they're in a season where there's a lot of peer pressure, where you're just kind of going with the flow and doing what everybody else is doing. And then somebody invades or violates your personal rules. And especially as an adolescent, you don't want to like get a lot of negative attention. So you just don't say anything, right? And then we start to harbor resentment, or then we start to see our relationships fall apart. And so I remember sitting down with this one teen girl, and I walked her through this exercise, and I'm going to walk you through it too, because it's the beginning of understanding the duplex. And let me zoom out for just a second and say, we're going to use this as a metaphor, okay? Not like an actual physical entity, But I want you to be able to picture this in your mind visually and use this metaphor because once you understand this metaphor, you can apply it to almost every kind of scenario in your life. You just have to understand the framework of the metaphor. It's kind of like what we covered in the last episode about the road being wide and you have your guardrails. And once you have that picture in your head, you can pretty much use that metaphor to go, hey, you're on the shoulder for me and it's really getting uncomfortable. Or, hey, this is a guardrail. This is like a deal breaker for me. This is going to an extreme that I'm not just uncomfortable with, but it's just something I don't know if I can do, right? So same thing. This is a metaphor that once you understand it, you can build on it. You can make it your own depending on what's going on in your life. So going back to this adolescent girl that I was working with, I asked her, let's plan a hypothetical pretend barbecue, like a party. And these people are going to be coming to your house. And I said, I want you to imagine that you're going to have this party in the backyard. And let's talk about why it's going to be in the backyard, because we're going to invite not just your best friends, we're going to invite some acquaintances, and those acquaintances can bring a guest. And so there might even be a few people that you don't know that are coming to your party. So if they're coming to your party and you're going to host your party in the backyard, why? Let's start with that. Why would we want to do it in the backyard instead of inviting everybody into your house? Because a lot of us maybe wouldn't mind doing that. Maybe you wouldn't mind having a party and hosting a party in your home with people that you don't know. But most people will go, well, there's something different about the backyard versus in the house, right? That backyard feels a little bit more casual. It feels like it's a little bit more accessible. And especially if we don't know people, the more they're kind of coming into the house, the more intimate it starts to feel, right? And that's the point. And so that's why we're going to have this barbecue in the backyard. And so then the next question I ask them is, okay, well, if we're going to have a barbecue in our backyard, how do you know how to contain the party in your backyard so that it doesn't go into your neighbor's backyard? And this usually gets into a property limits discussion, which most people would say, well, I have a fence. I have a fence that separates my yard from someone else's property. And so in this metaphor, and if you don't have a fence, you might say, well, I've got these row of trees, or my neighbor and I know where this ends and their property begins. And maybe you might even need to communicate that to your guests if you don't have a fence, that, hey, this is my property, that's not my property, right? And so these property lines, and we're going to, for the metaphor's sake, we're going to talk about there being a fence. And so usually I ask people, well, how would you describe a really good fence? And this is where it gets fun because a lot of people have different theories behind what makes a good fence. And so some people say, I would love to have a brick wall, right? And I don't even want to see my neighbors. And other people say a privacy fence is just perfect. It's, a good wooden tall fence where you have neighbors. You might even be able to see their rooftop, but you're not seeing into each other's yard. And then of course I always laugh because I bring up, if you've ever lived on an installation, the backyard usually has a chain link fence, right? Where you even share a part of the fence with your neighbor. And not only can you see through that fence, you can see the neighbor's dog. You can see whether or not they cleaned up after their dog. You can see the party that they're having in their backyard. You can see everything and they can see everything into your yard too. And we have a little laugh because aren't those fences next to pointless, right? So I bring this up because this also came from a moment in my own story when Matt and I, before we were even in the military, we lived in Kentucky, and we lived in Lexington, Kentucky, and we were going to seminary, and we lived off this beautiful, beautiful road. We actually started in Wilmore, Kentucky, where the seminary was. And then we dreamed of finding we were so poor, so poor, but we dreamed about trying to find a little bungalow house that was right off this amazing road that had these huge trees, and the trees hung over the road. And in the spring there was blooms and it would cover the road. And in the fall, there was every color of leaf that would just hang like a canopy over this giant road with these giant trees and these amazing brick homes that looked like they had been there forever. And it was just magical. And so it worked out for us to find this cheap little bungalow that probably should have been condemned, but we moved into it and we lived there for about a year or two. And we would go for walks And I would go for runs in this amazing neighborhood that I would never be able to afford, but I would go for a run and dream about someday being able to live in a neighborhood like we were living like adjacent to. And I remember going for a run and finding this one house, and I was never able to find it again. I just had mindlessly gone for a run, didn't pay attention to what street it was on, but it stopped me in my tracks, this house, because it was this amazing brick home and it had this amazing brick wall that was the fence for the backyard. And you could just barely see that this fence was likely a wraparound fence for their backyard. And it had this most amazing vine of roses that was climbing and blooming on this brick wall for a fence. And it just stopped me in my tracks. And I thought to myself, that is the most perfect home, right? It just was regal and it was beautiful and it had flowers and it was stately. But then I had another thought, and it was kind of a sad thought. And that was, I bet they don't know their neighbors. And I bet their neighbors don't know them, because being behind that brick wall of a fence communicates a message that's basically like, I don't want you to know what's happening in my life. And the only way to get invited is a formal invitation, maybe even to have to walk through my home to get to the backyard. And so suddenly that brick wall, as beautiful as it was, didn't seem like it was the ideal structure or boundary for a state of healthiness for someone living in that home. Now, maybe you would feel differently. Maybe I would feel differently. But I will say, after COVID, after moving a million times, there is something beautiful about community, knowing your neighbors, and having people in your life. And so I don't think that even today I would want that brick wall. But I want you guys to hold on to that, because the kind of fence that we find ourselves leaning towards and wanting, especially in this metaphor, will say a lot about where we are, the state of our health, the state of the health of our relationships, and possibly what we need to do next. Okay. So now let's go back to the barbecue. So we're going to have a barbecue. We're going to invite people, and people can bring guests. So they're likely to bring somebody we don't know. We've said it's in the backyard. And let's just agree that for the sake of knowing where we end and someone begins, and knowing what's going on with our neighbors around us, not in a nosy way, but just kind of in a community way. I'm hoping some of you guys listening who have lived on installations have very fond, wonderful memories as well of times when you did live next to a neighbor that had that chain link fence. And you were kind of grateful that you knew your neighbor and knew them that well, at least well enough that you could say hello, well enough that you knew their dog next door, right? So there was something good about it. So let's just agree that some kind of fence that allows you to either see what's happening in the property next to you, or if it is a privacy fence, that it's not quite so high and so overly structured, or just so built in such a way that it blocks everybody out, that some kind of understandable privacy fence makes sense. Okay. So now that we're going to have this barbecue, you're inviting everybody over. And let's imagine everybody has come to your party, and you, by the way, spent the weekend before like doing the landscaping in your backyard, and you have planted new flowers and you remulched, and you just spent a whole day really preparing your yard for this party that you were going to have, because you were just so excited to create a space that was going to be amazing for your guests, right? And so everybody starts coming to your event, and you have told them that they can come around the house and go through the back gate to come into the backyard. That might be the easiest way to get to the backyard, up to you and whether or not you want everybody going straight through your house to the backyard, right? That kind of, it's allowed, right? But we'll just say for now, we asked people to come around the house to the fence, to the backyard, easiest way to come in. So people are coming into your backyard through the gate and inside your fence. And some people have brought children, and that's great. However, you were not anticipating children, and you forgot to mention that maybe children shouldn't come to this barbecue, right? Because maybe you didn't come up with the food for it. Maybe you don't have an activity for them for whatever reason. Maybe you're really just hoping for an adult party, but now we've got kids there, right? And now one of your, let's say it's spouses that are planning this. Let's say your husband his friend has brought another female guest who's also brought her children. You've never met this guest before. She's very sweet, but she is, let me just be honest and kind of throw out an awkward scenario. Okay. I'm not trying to judge anybody. I'm not trying to make this in any way hurtful or offensive, but I'm just trying to imagine scenarios that might make it a little awkward for you. That's the point of this conversation. Okay. So let's say that this guest that has come to your party did not understand the dress code, right? And let's say she's wearing something that makes you a little bit uncomfortable, but you're going to be really nice and kind to her anyways. But everybody is kind of looking at this poor person who is dressed not quite for this kind of event. And she's brought her kids, bless her heart, that are just really rambunctious. Maybe they're toddlers and now they start running in your new flowers, in your bed that you have just worked a whole Saturday to make beautiful for this event, right? So now we start having some frustrating feelings, right? And I always ask everybody, what do we do? Right? What do we do? Or do we do anything at all? Right? No wrong answers here, but it's important to listen to your body as something is off and you are trying to figure out what you do. And so now that you know something is wrong, you've got to decide, maybe you let go and you don't obviously say anything to her about what she's wearing because you can't fix that, right? And you just kind of brush that aside and that's her choice and that's great and that's fine. But now we have an issue with the kids, right? Because the kids are tearing up your yard. They're tearing up the yard. And because your kids came downstairs and saw the issue, they're trying to help a little bit and they've now invited those kids inside. And now we are running with muddy shoes into the house when we were trying to keep the barbecue in the backyard, right? So now we have a series of issues going on. Do you correct those children? Do you talk with the woman that you don't really know very well about her doing something with her children? Or do we just let it go and absorb the frustration and carry the resentment that we're likely going to have later because now we're going to have to mop the floor because of all the mud on the floor? And maybe we're just going to tell ourselves that was just the price of planning a barbecue in my house. And maybe I should never do that again because I lost control of the situation, and that you will walk away carrying the burden and the frustration and the resentment of your choice, even though it was not your choice for the kids to come or for the kids to do the things that you hoped that they didn't want to do. And this is one of the things that we do in life and relationships every day. We, for the sake of keeping peace, and again, I'm not talking about the other extreme of like flying off the handle and going into a complete rage and ruining your own party. That's why those extremes are so important. But what we do when we don't know what to do is we often will go to the other extreme, which is go completely passive, completely silent, and just allow people to destroy something around us, something that is important to us, not say anything, and somehow blame ourselves for what happened and absorb the complexity of what just happened in that relationship, right? Just simply to keep the peace or to not cause any further problems. And sometimes that is an okay answer. And so I'm not here to judge and say that that's the wrong answer and you shouldn't do that anymore. What I am trying to do is wake you up to your choice, that you are making a choice, and that's okay if you make that choice, but you're making that choice to choose the passive role instead of a different choice that we can also talk about. And you end up inheriting the consequences of whatever choice you made. So it's less about what's the right choice, and it's more about you owning the fact that you do have a choice, okay? It's about acknowledging what's happening in your body, that something is upsetting you, a boundary has been crossed, something is happening that you don't like, and that you have made a choice to kind of swallow that frustration, to not address it, and instead just absorb the complexity and carry the burden yourself, okay? So now this wonderful, sweet woman who has come to the party with her kids recognizes or overhears you saying that your feet are starting to hurt and you probably shouldn't have worn those really great wedges that you picked out, and that you are looking forward to changing your shoes. And she comes up to you and says, hey, you know what? Can I go in your house, into your room, into your closet? I'd be happy to go get your flip-flops for you. Okay, what comes up on you again? Now compare that to if she were to come up to you and say, hey, I saw we're out of ice. Can I help you by going into the kitchen and getting some more ice for the barbecue? What is the difference in your body as you get those two questions? Chances are the question about the ice feels a little bit more comfortable than allowing somebody that you don't know to go up to your room, into your closet, rummage through your closet, find your flip-flops and come back downstairs, right? And that also there's something in you that is recognizing that the more you are going into the house, the more intimate it feels, right? So we would agree that the backyard is a casual kind of public place, but because it is surrounded by a fence, it's not public to everyone. When we look at the front yard, right, where there is no fence, it's very public, right? You might meet your neighbors out there as you go to the mailbox. You've got someone delivering your mail, that you've got Amazon employees that might be coming up to your doorstep, ringing your doorbell. It's a very public place. Even though it's your space, it's more public, it's more out there. Everybody accepts the fact that people may come onto your property and come up to your front door. But as you get to the backyard, it feels a little bit more personal. If you have, let's say, Amazon employees that are going around to your back door without permission and dropping packages off there, something feels a little bit off because it's less public, right? But as you go into your house, you've got a living room, you've got a kitchen, and that is more intimate than the backyard. And then if you're going upstairs in this hypothetical, this metaphor of a house, right? As you go upstairs and you go into your bedroom, that's even more intimate. And as you go into your closet, let's say you keep your grandmother's keepsake pearls in your closet, in a safe in your closet even, right? That's even more intimate. Like even fewer people have access to those spaces. And so the deeper you go into your house, the more intimate the space is, right? This is very important when we talk about the marriage being a duplex and not a house, okay? So the barbecue is over, okay? We've all survived the barbecue. Let's talk about marriage. Because when we get married, we come in with this expectation that we're supposed to share everything. We're supposed to share roles. We're supposed to share responsibilities. We're supposed to share bank accounts. We're supposed to share the house itself. And all of those things are fine. That's totally okay. But usually what happens is because we didn't talk about our values and talk about really breaking down what those values mean to us, we fail to have the conversations about, am I the one that cleans the kitchen all the time, or do we clean the kitchen together? Do I do the dishes and you do the countertops, or do I unload versus you loading? Do we even do it together? Do I make dinner most of the time, or do you make dinner most of the time? Or do we share in that responsibility as well? What do we do on Saturdays? If one person grew up cleaning on Saturdays and the other person didn't grow up cleaning with their family on Saturdays, then we're going to be struggling to figure out what do we do with Saturdays, right? So we tend to get married and we live under this one roof thinking that we're going to magically all work this out together and that we're going to be able to share everything. Let's talk about finances for a second, right? Like that we are going to be able to have a joint account and know how to spend the same way together. And usually you've got a couple, one spends more than the other. Like one person is a spender, the other person is a saver. In our household, we are both, right? But we just spend on different things. And if we do have conflict, it's because we value different things to spend money on. And then we start asking each other like, you are wanting to spend money on this, but I don't value it as much as the things that I spend money on. And I'd rather you value the things that I spend money on, right? You can see where this is going. It's because we don't talk about what we actually value and break that down and work out how is it that we share our finances? How is it that we share our chores? How is it that we share our parenting? What does it actually mean to be a couple? What does it actually mean to be a husband and wife? What does it actually mean for those military couples that are listening? What are the expectations for the service member whose life and career revolves around the mission, and for the spouse to need to be submissive to that whole process? Talking about what are our expectations of what life is going to look like when the spouse wants to have a job, or when the spouse wants to do something other than that, or who goes first, right? So all of those things start to make things very messy in this single home that we have created for ourselves and then expected us to do really well and just figure it out naturally. So what I'm trying to say here is it is important that you share roles, share responsibilities, share finances. And it's okay if you don't on some of those things. That's a preference for each couple. But from a metaphor perspective, can I just say out loud that boundaries are important, even in marriage? That boundaries, healthy boundaries, kind boundaries actually makes your relationship and your marriage stronger. Um, Being able to articulate what's important to you, what your rules are, is very important to respecting each other and understanding how each other works, and then being able to work with and around each other. So, in the barbecue example, if you are always taking the passive approach because you don't want to have conflict in your life, maybe you grew up with a lot of conflict in your family of origin, maybe you've had a lot of conflict in your marriage and you don't want any more, right? It's so much easier sometimes to swallow your frustration and to not bring up any conflict and just say, you know what? I can replant the flowers next weekend, not owning the fact that you're going to have to spend hundreds of dollars buying those plants again, right? And then find yourself taking another Saturday to fix it. Or do you just leave it and you just have this memory of a destroyed piece of your landscaping that you were once very proud of, right? And so we've got to learn to be able to articulate, when are these boundaries? When are these things that step up within us that say rules are not bad? Boundaries are not bad. To be able to communicate to those that are coming to a barbecue in real life, right? To be able to say, hey, this is going to be a potluck, so please bring a dish. Even better, here's a sign up genius link where you can have categories where we only need 2 people to bring desserts. We only need 3 people to bring vegetables. And there's boundaries within that conversation as well, right? Because once 3 people sign up for vegetables and sides, then they're going to have to choose something else. Like that is closed, right? And that you being able to put out, here's the dress code, or that here is whether or not kids can come or not. And that the event ends at 10 o'clock, right? And I love when I go to an event and somebody says, we are so glad that you're having a great time. We want you to continue to have a great time. But at 10 o'clock, we are going to bed. And y'all are going to have to decide what to do with yourselves because we're going to be done at 10 o'clock, which of course nobody wants to be in someone else's house when the hosts have left, right? Even better when they're like, hey, we're going to close this up at 8 o'clock where everybody can leave it at a decent hour and not be wondering when it's going to end. There's so much peace that comes over us when there are rules communicated. So being able to have the assertive ability to go up to this hypothetical barbecue guest and say, hey, I'm so glad that you could come. And I'm so glad that you were able to bring your kids. If I could just ask you to tell them to stay away from the flowers there in the corner, I would really appreciate it. Right? That's kind. It's not, it doesn't have to start conflict. Will it make her feel uncomfortable? Maybe even a little bit embarrassed? Maybe. But that's where we have to figure out, what do we own and what do we not own? If we are constantly trying to manage someone else's emotions, we will find ourselves enabling them because we can't manage someone. We can't manage that barbecue guest, that sweet mom. We cannot telepathically manage her into managing her own children with a look at just looking at her in a certain way. That's even more cruel. Or just not saying anything at all. She's not paying attention. The kids are continuing to destroy things. She's there to build community, not realizing that she's destroying community and didn't even know it. Right? So that's what enabling can mean. When you are trying to manage the situation by staying passive and not bringing up any conflict at all, not bringing any uncomfortable feelings up at all, you are enabling the behavior of someone else that they may not even realize is destructive and destructive to the relationship. When we communicate in kind ways, healthy boundaries, it actually honors that relationship and it invites them to get it right with us so that if they want to build a relationship with us, to build community with us, they then know how, right? Sometimes when things are really, really difficult and there are consequences for people's behavior, and we have to be able to say, here are those consequences. By talking about it, by being able to communicate what our boundaries are. If the other person is willing and can come back and apologize, to try to make amends, to make it right, to absorb those consequences, that helps rebuild the relationship too, because then they know that they've created destruction and they can start to make it right. And that all starts with your ability to communicate what happened in your body, that something was wrong, and that you identified what was wrong, and that in kindness, you were able to communicate a boundary, right? So, rules, boundaries, again, going back to our spectrum of extremes from the last episode, if you're going to an extreme where it's like too many rules and too rigid, no community, no intimacy, no relationship building can happen there. But it's also true of the other side of the extreme. If there are no rules and if you're completely passive and you're enabling people's behavior and they can do anything they want, that is also destructive. And you know what? It's the most destructive to you because you're the one that sees it every day, absorbs it every day. And if you have kids, it's also destructive to them. They don't realize it yet, but they are adopting certain perspectives of what home life and marriage should look like. And they're going to go out into the world and replay that and then have to live through those consequences themselves in the future. So you are inviting destruction into your spirit, but also passing it down. You're passing it down. Okay. So here's what I'm trying to say. From a metaphor perspective, marriage is not a single home with no boundaries where we just share the space and we share everything in it and it magically, organically all works out. Marriage is more like a duplex. Okay. It's a duplex. So follow me with this metaphor, okay? In a duplex, if you've ever lived on an installation, especially, hopefully you have this picture in your mind. Some of these homes are great homes, but they share a wall. They're a duplex, right? It's a decent sized house and you share the space as far as the property, but you share a wall, but they're two separate homes. So duplex, two homes sharing a wall, and in the backyard, they're also sharing part of the fence. And I want you to imagine there's also a gate that is in that backyard that probably doesn't exist in a real duplex piece of property, right? But I want you to, for this metaphor, to imagine that in the backyard, we have our chain link fence that we get on the installation, right? That's not ideal, but we can see what's happening in our yard and in our neighbor's yard. In this case, our spouse's yard. And I want you to imagine there's also a gate that connects between your yard and their yard. Okay. So both of you live in one duplex, your spouse lives in the other duplex, and you have your own space. Isn't that wonderful? Those of you who've ever gone through a deployment, right? There is this, your own space where you have your own kitchen. And I want you to imagine your metaphorical kitchen, right? Use your imagination and it can be anything you want it to be, right? You have your own kitchen. You have your own living room space. You have your own furniture. Okay. And you go upstairs and you have your bedroom space. You have your closet space, and it is everything that you need it to be. And your spouse in their duplex has their own kitchen, has their own living room space, has their own bedroom, has their own closet, and it is everything that they need it to be. Maybe for the spouses listening, your house is colorful, or maybe it's in all the like amazing shades of neutral, that are peaceful and calming. And then maybe the service member, I'm hypothetically making all this up and putting everybody in boxes here. Maybe the service member, it's rugged and it's outdoorsy and you've got taxidermy hanging up in your, like, whatever your space needs to be. It is the space that makes you feel like home. It is what makes you feel centered and at peace. That is your space, which we all need. To be well, you all need your space within your spirit, sometimes physically in a place within your actual home. You need a space that is yours. Maybe just a desk. It may be just your nightstand where you keep the books that you're reading. It may be an office. It may be your back porch. But the point is that we all need that space, okay? And let's go into the backyard for a second, because in the backyard, you have a back porch and you've got a table, you've got a couple chairs maybe, you have grass, and maybe you have a place where you could plant flowers if you want to, and so does your spouse. Now, the state of our health is very revealing when we talk about our duplexes and what our property actually looks like. If I were to ask you what your property looks like right now, what your marriage looks like from the place of this duplex, I see so many couples, especially military couples, that are coming in and out of rotations, PCS assignments, deployments, anything like that. And the spouse at home has taken on so many responsibilities of parenting, home life, taking care of everybody else but themselves, some of them struggling to get jobs, all of that we've heard a million times, right? And they're also taking care of their spouse's yard because the military tells you, don't upset your service member, revolve around the mission, right? And so what ends up happening in this metaphor is you've got a spouse on her side of the duplex, and there are children running around, and their toys are everywhere, and they're littering the backyard, and they're also littering through her living room and her kitchen because she is just around them all day, every day. And we're just going to clean it up at some other point, right? But what is she doing? She's also watering her spouse's yard because they are gone. They're on deployment, and somebody's got to water the yard, right? You might even be going through the gate into their yard, watering the yard, making sure that when they get home, that yard is going to be nice and clean and green. And then you walk inside the house and you're checking on the house once a week to make sure everything looks the way that it's supposed to look and looks the way that he left it, right? And then you're leaving his house, locking the door, checking on that yard again, coming into your yard that is littered again with all the toys. And can we talk about the grass? The grass is dead because you've been spending so much time picking up all the toys, putting everything away and watering your spouse's yard that you have forgotten to water your own yard. So here's what I'm asking. Regardless if you're the spouse or the service member, what is the state of your yard? What is the state of your side of the duplex? Pause and think about that for a second. Do any of you even know what color you've painted the walls? Have you even straightened the picture that has been hanging on the wall and is crooked because somebody bumped into it and you just didn't feel like fixing it, right? What is the state of your space? Now, this is not about judging your spouse. It's about you recognizing the choices that you make. What are the choices that you make for you, right? And making sure that you are in a healthy state. Some of you are in relationships that are going through so much conflict and so much destruction that you're destroying each other's side of the duplex because you're just so resentful and you're so angry, and who knows what has happened between you for whatever reason. But I also work with couples who, when they get into arguments and get into fights, metaphorically speaking, they're literally taking turns going into each other's duplex and destroying each other's space, right? Like you're going into your spouse's duplex, not only screaming at him, but tearing down anything that is of value in their life. And then he comes over and does the same thing in your house. And the worse the fight gets, the more destructive it gets, right? Again, metaphorically speaking, because this can also be physical as well. But let's just keep it in like a metaphor of what the state of your spirit is in, right? And what we do to each other with our words, what we do with our energy when we allow ourselves to get in those kinds of conflict, right? Some of you have been allowing your spouse to come not only into your duplex, but go up the stairs, into your room, into your closet, into that safe that holds your grandmother's keepsake pearls, and has ripped those pearls apart and left everything destroyed that was ever of value to you around you, and left and went back to his duplex. Now, I'm using these gender roles, but they can go the other way around because there are a lot of wives, there are a lot of women out there that do the same thing to men every day, where you rip them to pieces, thinking that that's what's going to get them to change. But the only thing that you're doing is going into the most intimate places of their heart and their soul and ripping them to shreds and thinking that they're going to come out a new man. And that is not the way it works. We first have to recognize that there are varying degrees of intimacy, right? There's the backyard. And then there's also my closet where I keep my heart. Some of you are in a marriage where you are so hurt and you don't know how to fix it, that chain link fence that we laugh about because it's just so cheap and invisible and barely there, right? that you've replaced it with a brick wall, that you have closed off not only your heart, but you have genuinely closed yourself off from your spouse because it is easier and better than allowing any more destruction coming into your life. And for some of you, if there are safety concerns, like genuine safety concerns, we may have to start there for a little while, right? But there at least needs to be a conversation happening over that wall, right? Where you throw a ball over that yard and say, like, can we play this way, right? A communication that's lobbying back and forth, right? If there's genuine safety concerns, that maybe it does need to start there with a wall for right now, right? What I usually say, especially if they're not safety concerns, is that if there is destruction happening in your relationship, it is okay to have healthy boundaries, to go and close the gate. It doesn't have to be a wall, but you can close the gate. You can close the gate and you can choose to meet each other at that gate because you know those fences only go up to like your waist, right? Like they only go up so high and you can see each other, but you can close the gate. You could even lock the gate, but you can still see each other. You can still have a conversation and you can agree on what the rules will be. And even more, that you agree on how we're going to clean up each other's duplex. Because marriage is a lot about making a lot of mistakes where we accidentally destroy our spouse in ways that we ultimately will regret. Matt and I have always said, man, if we could go back and not say the things that we said that were like knife stabs to the heart to each other, right? Matt once said, and I loved this, that his ideal success of marriage was to get to the end of our life and have as few scars as possible, right? We created a lot of scars in the early years, but that doesn't mean you have to still keep knifing each other. Again, metaphorically speaking, right? You don't have to keep doing life and relationships that way. You can meet at the gate and you can decide what your rules will be, how you treat each other, what conflicts are going to look like, what your boundaries are for conflicts, when you're going to call a timeout, when you're going to go to your duplex and they're going to go to their duplex and we're going to calm down, right? When someone comes into your duplex and they're starting to destroy something, that you can say, just like you needed to say to that guest in the beginning with the barbecue, that you can say, you know what, this is not okay. I'm going to ask you to leave, not leave the marriage, but I'm going to call a timeout and I need to sit and I need to think a little bit. But this is getting destructive. Our conversation is getting destructive, right? So you get to own the space within your duplex. But when you are sitting in that duplex trying to decide what to do next, and you see the state of destruction around you, or you see the state of neglect around you, this is the hard part, because this is where you have to make a choice, where you have to face the choices that you have made to either neglect yourself or allow someone to cross boundaries that your body has been telling you are not okay. That's your choice. So being able to sit in your space, in your mind, in your duplex to say, you know what? I need to straighten that picture. And you know what? I never saw myself valuable enough to consider painting the walls. And you know what? I love the color yellow because I once was joy-filled. And people used to tell me that I brought joy into their life. And shouldn't this spot, this place that I get to sit with myself, remind me of the best version of myself? Maybe I want to paint my kitchen yellow, right? Maybe you need to take a moment to clean up what is around you. And maybe that looks like, everybody knows what that next thing is that you've been neglecting. Maybe that looks like that you value yourself enough to buy in real life the right food for your body. Maybe it's that you value yourself enough to go, I'm so exhausted picking up all the toys around my duplex. I need help. And that might turn into a conversation with your spouse where you need to ask for more. This might go the other way around, where you as a service member or as a spouse need to go to your spouse and go, how can I do more? Or maybe you're taking on a majority of things and you need to ask your spouse during this season for help, right? Maybe there are things going on your side of the duplex that you don't know how to fix. that you have reached the limit, that you don't know what the next step is. And maybe it's time you go over to your spouse's back porch, allow them to make you some lemonade and ask for their help, right? Water your grass. It's okay for you to water your spouse's grass, but it's not okay for you to have grass that is dying. And I see all the time couples where one spouse is not only watering their spouse's grass, but they're like planting flowers over there and doing this whole landscaping thing, and they're like going overboard. And that spouse never asked for any of that. They simply ask for a little bit of water and to make sure, like when I'm gone, that the grass is cut or mowed, right? So sometimes we are doing all the wrong things because maybe that's actually what we want our spouse to do for us. Can you come over to my side, to my yard? Would you be willing to help me make my space more livable? But maybe you've been sending them these messages that they're not going to get by overworking and overgiving on things that they never asked for. Or do they value, right? So this is the power of the metaphor, right? Because when I ask you, what's happening in your side of the duplex? What does your marriage as a duplex look like? What does your spouse's duplex look like from your perspective? What does yours look like? And having this conversation as a couple to go, what is the state of us? What is the state of us? So many times I hear, and I'm not trying to give service members a hard time, but they do have structured, especially if you're still in, they do have the structure of PT, or at least the accountability of staying in shape. So much is like professional development and everything is kind of worked into their job, that they have these opportunities for their structure, their duplex to be pretty cleaned up, to be pretty tidy, maybe even the time to do it, right? And for the spouse to feel like they've got to keep on their side, the kids, the budget, the stress, all the things, and they're living in a state of disarray, right? Where they need help, but they're afraid or don't know how to ask for help. And that may be a stereotype. That may be not what your relationship looks like, but you won't know if you don't talk to each other, right? Seasons are different. Seasons of life and parenting are different. There were seasons where I worked a little bit more, that asked a lot more of Matt at home. And that was a struggle. We had to figure it out. There were other seasons where I had to turn down my responsibilities because he needed to go, right? So seasons change as we're going into empty nesting. It is going to be a whole other conversation about what are we going to do with our own time and our own health, and what are we going to do to really create a space for both of us where we are healthy and we reorient ourselves to the rules and the boundaries of how we're going to do life. What does he enjoy doing? What do I enjoy doing? How do we choose to spend our time? What things do we choose to invest in? If I want to go read and he doesn't want to read, that's okay, because I can find a space in the house to read and he can do something different, right? But we're going to have those conversations at some point to talk about what are your goals, right? And that we're not, I'll tell you, there's the sign of enmeshment in your relationship is that when we start to bring up these healthier states of being, when we're working on ourselves, when we're, again, not going to an extreme where we're asking everybody to revolve around us. It's okay for you to make changes in it, and it asks something of people around you, but we're not asking everybody to revolve around you, right? But it's a good sign that your relationship is enmeshed if you are making healthy decisions in the messy middle that takes care of you, while also respecting that you are in a relationship where we do need to share in doing things together, and we do need to not have it all revolve around us. And that's the messy middle here, right? But you're in enmeshment when you're trying to individualize and take care of yourself in some areas that need to be neglected, and your spouse doesn't know what to do to fill the space, or that it creates conflict, right? If you're pulling away just a little bit in a healthy way and it sends your relationship into a crisis, that's a sign of enmeshment. Now, if you're taking care of yourself and your spouse doesn't care, then that's the opposite extreme, right? We are neglecting each other. We might need to talk about coming to the fence, going to each other's back porch, spending time in their duplex and watching a show that they like, right? Going to your duplex, watching a show that you like, whatever that looks like, right? That we are less distant and more opportunities for intimacy, right? So that is my closing question for you today is, what does your duplex look like? Your individual side, but also the shared duplex of your marriage. I would love to hear from you. I hope that this metaphor is helpful. Share with me. I'm not going to share it with the rest of the world, but if it helps you to say that you've told somebody, right? Send an email to me and tell me, what does your duplex look like? Send me a voice message. There's a link in the show notes where you can send like a 2-minute voice message. Send me 5 if you have to, because if it cuts you off, right? But share with me what your duplex looks like, because there's power in talking about what is. Because once you say it out loud, now you get to do something about it. It is your choice. It is a choice. So boundaries are healthy. Rules that you decide together are healthy. Communicating those are very hard, right? And maybe we'll talk about in the next episode, how do you communicate in kindness while also being direct? Because that also sounds like a dichotomy, right? And so today's duplex is really about, how do you own your own health, your own wellness, to grow individually, to have a healthy space yourself, while also respecting that you are in a relationship that very much affects you, affects your health, affects your state of health, right? And that you're also somewhat responsible for what's happening in the other duplex, even though you don't own it, right? Like you don't own that side, but you are committed and responsible together to the state of wellness of what's happening in the other person's duplex. If you see your spouse going downhill and going into neglect, you promised in marriage to watch over them, to take care of them. And sometimes that means having a healthy conversation on boundaries to go, this is not what we agreed on, right? We did not agree from a metaphor perspective that I would keep my side healthy while yours spirals down into, let's say, filth and uncleanliness. And I mean that in a metaphor perspective, because if we have in a metaphor mice and vermin and it's dirty and there's not hygiene on that side, right? And things are going into a depression on that side, that's going to affect your side of the duplex for sure. And we also don't want to see that person go into that kind of neglect, right? So marriage is about making the commitment to go, we agreed. What did you agree on? Have you even talked about it? What are the rules? What are the values that you've decided to share together? It is in sharing and communicating those values and those rules that we define what is healthy, so that when something doesn't look healthy or doesn't feel healthy, we can now hold each other accountable to go, we agreed that this is not what we were going to do to each other and what we were going to do to ourselves. And then we weren't going to allow or encourage that to happen in the other person as well. Okay. So I'd love to hear from you. What does your duplex look like? I hope this was helpful. I think that this is the right track for the podcast. I really hope that you're getting a lot from this messy middle, these dichotomies, these interesting places of what does it mean to do one thing, but not go too far that direction. And you've got to swing back the other way too. So keeping these two very important things in mind at the same time. So I know there's a lot happening in the world. I know there's a lot happening in the military right now. I'm taking a little bit of a break from social media just to give myself the space to really think about and watch what's happening before I respond to some of it. But just know that I'm thinking about you. I care about you. I hope you are doing well. Thank you for listening. Please share this episode with someone else that comes to mind as you've listened to it. And again, thank you so much for your support and your willingness to listen. So until next time. Thank you for listening to the Life Giver podcast. Please leave a review, share this episode with your friends, and send me a voice message or connect with me on Substack. You can find out more about me using links in the show notes.